Thorin's journey to reclaim Erebor hinged on two main objectives: defeat the dragon and find the Arkenstone. So what if I told you that the movies got both of these crucial points wrong? Not only is Smaug's defeat drastically different in the book, with a magical bird saving the day, but the finding of the Arkenstone is altered as well. But don't worry, in today's video, I'm gonna clear everything up by comparing the beginning of the third and final movie in the Hobbit trilogy to its corresponding pages in the book, and finding every omission, revision, and addition along the way. So by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what happened in Tolkien's original telling of this story, and you can decide for yourself whether Peter Jackson's edits were justified or not. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 10 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the Hobbit Edition. Before we get started, I wanted to shout out this commenter from the last episode. If you'd like to be featured next, be sure to drop your thoughts below when you're done watching. Also, if you're new here and enjoy the video, click that like button and share with a Hobbit-loving friend. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened during the opening scene of the Battle of the Five Armies film. That way, it's fresh on our mind for the analysis. As you can imagine, the movie picks up right where the last one left off as Smaug is heading to Lake Town. Tauriel gathers the dwarves and Bard's kids, and they get in a boat to sail to safety. Another person in the town trying to get to safety is the Master, who greedily piles gold onto a large boat and tries to sail away. But where is Bard? Well, if you remember from last episode, Bard got arrested and is in jail, but somehow, as the dragon is spraying flames across the town, Bard ties together blankets to create a long rope and catches the Master as he rows down the alleyways of the lake. How Bard created a rope that quickly is beyond me, but way to go, bud. After he is broken free from his cell, Bard gets a bow and some arrows and makes his way to the bell tower to try to take down the dragon. Bard's children see him firing arrows on the tower, and this causes the son, Bane, to run off and take the black arrow to his father, which he had hidden in the last movie. After getting the black arrow from his son, Bard creates a makeshift wind lance to fire the large arrow as Smaug charges toward him. And right as the dragon is charging, Bard sees the opening in his scales and fires the arrow right into him, killing the dragon. Smaug flies into the air one last time and then plummets into the lake, smashing the Master and his boat in the process. Bilbo and the dwarves see the dragon fall and realize that Smaug has died, which causes Thorin to immediately begin walking toward the mountain entrance. After getting a quick glance at Gandalf in captivity, the movie cuts back to the people of Lake Town trying to collect themselves on the shoreline, and we see Tauriel and Kili have a moment before the dwarves hop in a boat and head towards the mountain. We also see Alfred being a nuisance, but thankfully Bard and Bane are still alive and stop Alfred from taking things too far. Alfred then jumps on the King Bard bandwagon, but Bard is adamant that they must first focus on tending to the wounded and finding shelter. And that is where our scenes end for this week. All in all, it's not that long of a sequence in the film, only about 18 minutes or so, which compared to my last few episodes is pretty short, as previously we were covering hour-long segments of the films. But as you'll soon see, there's a reason this opening is under 20 minutes, and that's because Peter Jackson pretty much cut out an entire chapter from the book, which we'll be covering in the plot changes. But first, let's get things started by heading into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First up, we have our character differences, and it's pretty simple today, as there are only three added characters: Tauriel, Legolas, and Alfred. These characters don't show up in the Hobbit book, and Tauriel and Alfred are just completely made up in general. Also, Bard's kids did exist, but they're nowhere to be found in this chapter. I only know he had kids because Tolkien says that Bard was succeeded by his son Bane as King of Dale. Next, we have timeline, which has three key differences. First, the movie once again makes it seem like only a day's journey from Lake Town to the mountain, when in the book it is clearly multiple days away. So the idea that Kili and the other dwarves left Lake Town and went to the mountain in seemingly a few hours is just ridiculous. The second timeline issue we have is that in the book, the dwarves are in the mountain for about 2 days while Smaug goes to attack Lake Town. But in the movie, Bilbo and the dwarves watch the whole time as Smaug lights up the town, as if the entire attack was only a couple of hours or less. And finally, the last timeline discrepancy is the fact that in the book, the people of Lake Town stay on the shoreline for about a week before leaving to head toward the mountain. And they only left once the elves came to give them aid, but we'll talk about that more in the plot changes. Finally, before getting into the plot, we have location. First up, I have to mention once again that Dol Guldur isn't in the Hobbit book. Gandalf does go there with the White Council around the same time as Thorin's journey, but it doesn't line up perfectly, and he never gets captured, so the whole thing is wrong, really. If you want to learn the true story of Dol Guldur, I have an entire video on my channel dedicated to covering the complete timeline of that dark fortress and what Gandalf did there. Then our second location difference kind of goes hand in hand with our timeline change about the distance between the mountain and the town on the lake. It is way larger in the book than the movie shows. Now, before I head into the plot changes, I want to give a shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, Robo-Steve, and the rest of my incredible members who help make videos like this possible every month. Also, if you're wanting to follow along with me as I do this series, you can claim your free trial of Audible to get the Hobbit audiobook for free right now. Or if you want, you can get any other audiobook of your choice for free. Maybe you should go back to the Lord of the Rings MVM series and start from the beginning with the Fellowship of the Ring. The possibilities are endless. No matter what you decide, check out the link in the description to get your free audiobook and support the channel at the same time, no purchase necessary. Now, with that being said, let's dive into the plot changes. If you think we're going to start out our plot changes this week with Bard and Smaug's attack on Lake Town, you'd be wrong. However, I can't really blame you because that is how the Battle of the Five Armies movie starts. But that isn't how this section of the book begins, because before Tolkien ever tells us about the fate of Lake Town, we hear about Bilbo and the dwarves' time inside the mountain while Smaug is away. Which leads us to our first key change today that triggers a string of omissions, as nearly all of chapter 13 in the Hobbit book is cut from the film. And that first key change is the fact that Bilbo and the dwarves do not watch Smaug attack Lake Town. In fact, they don't even know that Smaug went to Lake Town. If you remember from last episode, the last thing we heard from Thorin's company was when Bilbo barely escaped Smaug in the mountain and ran back up to the dwarves with his backside nearly on fire. He then filled the dwarves in on his conversation with the dragon, and he begged them to get inside the mountain and shut the secret door, for he feared that Smaug would be leaving to hunt the mountainside at any moment. Well, Smaug did do that, and the dwarves reluctantly listened to Bilbo, just barely getting inside before Smaug smashed the side of the mountain, shutting them in for good. Then after this, Smaug flew to Lake Town as he wrongly assumed that the men of the lake were behind this giant plot, because of Bilbo's reference to barrels. So as you can see, the dwarves and Bilbo had no idea Smaug was going to do that, because they were too busy being huddled up inside the dark secret passage. So what does Thorin's company get up to while Smaug is away? Well, that brings us to our next few changes, which are all omitted moments from the book. First up, we read about Bilbo going into the mountain for a third time. Remember, in the book, he went the first time and stole a goblet, which woke up Smaug. Then the second time he went is when he spoke to the dragon. And now this is the third time, with Smaug being gone and Bilbo has free reign. Because they didn't know that Smaug went to Lake Town, they thought he might have returned to the mountain or be returning at any moment. So they had waited inside the dark secret passage for quite some time before Thorin got fed up and decided to move deeper in. Eventually, they got to where the passage opened up to a larger cavern, and Bilbo, who was at the front of the group, fell headlong into the hall. The dwarves all stopped at the bottom of the tunnel and fell silent as they were sure the noise would wake up Smaug again. But after a while of sitting in the dark, Bilbo couldn't take it anymore and shouted for them to get a light. Eventually, they did so, and after giving Bilbo a torch, they waited for him to investigate further. You see, since he was their burglar, they figured it was his responsibility to do the investigations. So Bilbo did just that and went further into the hall with his torch while the frightened dwarves hung back. Now this brings us to another important omitted moment and a key difference from the movie, and that is the discovery of the Arkenstone. In the movie, it is discovered upon Bilbo's first time into the mountain, and it's the key object he is sent to retrieve. In the book, however, it isn't such an important artifact at first. Of course, it is important, but in the book they don't even instruct Bilbo to find it. He just happens to come upon it while wandering through the Hall of Treasures. He immediately knows what it is, as the dwarves had told him about it before, but he picks it up for himself. It's an interesting moment in the book in which we have some internal dialogue that sounds very familiar to the effect the ring has on someone. Here's what we read. Suddenly, Bilbo's arm went towards it, drawn by its enchantment. His small hand would not close about it, for it was a large and heavy gem. But he lifted it, shut his eyes, and put it in his deepest pocket. Now I'm a burglar indeed, thought he, but I suppose I must tell the dwarves about it sometime. They did say I could pick and choose my own share, and I think I would choose this if they took all the rest. All the same, he had an uncomfortable feeling that the picking and choosing had not really been meant to include this marvelous gem, and that trouble would yet come of it. And as you know, trouble will indeed come of it by the end of the story. Now moving on to our next change, we head into the entire company's exploration through the mountain. You see, after a while of searching around, Bilbo ended up getting lost. When he was walking around, a large bat flew down over his head, which made Bilbo jump and drop his torch. It hit the ground and promptly went out, leaving him in the pitch-black dark. He began to yell for the dwarves, who were still scared in this secret passage, but Thorin and Balin eventually got the courage to lead the others to save Bilbo in the dark, saying that it was about time they did their part for the Hobbit. Once they found Bilbo in the dark, they all set about looking at the vast treasures, with Fili and Kili finding magic harps with silver strings, and Thorin finding valuable armor and jewels. And you know what else is found during this time? Bilbo's mithril vest. That's right, he gets it in this chapter before the battle ever begins, before Smaug is even defeated. And speaking of Smaug, we have one more part of this omitted chapter to cover before we head into his attack on Lake Town. And that final omission is Bilbo's reality check to the dwarves that Smaug is still out there and probably going to return soon. You see, the dwarves had been so mesmerized by the treasure that they nearly forgot about the dragon. But Bilbo, who was not as obsessed by treasures as the dwarves, sat down and began to feel hungry and worried. So he went up to Thorin and told him that they really should get a move on and form a plan. So Thorin did just that, as Bilbo had kind of become the unofficial leader of the group by this point. Thorin led the company through the mountain, and eventually they came to Thror's chamber and feasting area. From there they went up to the front gate and finally got their first breath of fresh morning air in many hours, and felt the sunlight on their faces. Balin then led the group to a lookout, which was about a 5 hours march from the front gate. And by the way, that just goes to show you what I meant earlier when I talked about the location and timeline changes. It took a 5 hours march to head from the front gate to the lookout post. But at the end of the second film, we see Bilbo run from the front gate to a lookout area in a matter of seconds as Smaug flies to Lake Town. Then the company perfectly sees Lake Town from there. It's ridiculous. I mean, just think of how far away a 5 hours march would have been. So yeah, the sheer size of the mountain and the distance between Erebor, Dale, and Lake Town was massively underplayed in the films. But anyway, that wraps up chapter 13 as Thorin's company eventually make it to this lookout about 2 days after they last heard from Smaug. And in chapter 14, Tolkien rewinds the clock to fill the reader in on what happened all those hours ago when Smaug left to Lake Town. So let's head into the second half of today's changes and look at just how much the movie changed about Bard's encounter with the dragon. First up, we read that the dragon didn't find the people of Lake Town completely unprepared, because Bard knew what was coming. Remember, Bard in the book is drastically different from the first movie. In fact, this chapter is the first time we're hearing about him. In the book, he is the captain of the archers and well respected among the men of Lake Town. One night while the watchmen were out, they see golden light flashing from the mountain. The optimistic guards in the group think that the king under the mountain has truly returned and is forging gold once again. But one man in the group asks them which king under the mountain is it, the dwarf or the dragon? This man is of course Bard, and in his wisdom he knows that the dragon will soon come to them. So he starts shouting orders and goes to the master of the town to urge him to command the men to fight. And because of this, the people of Lake Town are actually a bit more prepared than the movie shows. Now because of this, we have a few changes I need to throw out there pretty quickly. First, to address the quick cut we get to Dol Guldur, Gandalf was never captured there. Second, all of the dwarves are at the mountain in the book. Kili does not have a love interest, he does not get shot by an arrow causing him to get sick, and therefore there aren't a few of the dwarves still in Lake Town. They are all up at the mountain. And third, as you can tell by what we just discussed regarding Bard, he was not put in jail. In fact, he was so well respected by the men of the town that I doubt they would have put him in jail even if the master commanded it. Which brings us to the next change, and that is the fact that Bard wasn't the only one trying to fight the dragon. The men loved Bard so much that they stood firm with him, firing arrows at the dragon over and over again. Eventually, though, they did give up one by one, getting scared and jumping into the water. And yes, we do read about the master abandoning the town with his belongings, but Bard stands strong even after all of his men desert him or die. So what happens once Bard is the last one standing? Obviously, as we discussed earlier, Bard's children aren't in the book, and this is the first time we're ever hearing about Bard in general. So how does he have a black arrow, and how does he know about Smaug's weakness? Well, first of all, he doesn't actually know about Smaug's weak point until this very moment, and he learns about it in the strangest way possible, which never gets shown in the movie. A bird tells him. That's right, a thrush, probably the same one who Bilbo got angry at in our last episode, landed on Bard's shoulder and spoke to him right before he fired a black arrow. It told him to wait until he could see the opening under Smaug's left breast. And while Bard waited for his chance, the thrush told him about all of the tidings from the mountain. Then, seeing the hollow in Smaug's armor, Bard loosed his black arrow and killed the beast. Now that brings up an interesting detail that the movie changed, and that is the size of the arrow. Why do I mention this? Well, I'm obligated to talk about all the changes I find, but also I think this is kind of significant from a realism standpoint. I know, we're literally talking about dragons and birds that speak, but let's think about this. In the movie, the arrow is metal and about 4 feet long. When Bard fires it, it sticks into Smaug's chest, maybe 2 feet deep, if even that. In the book, though, the arrow is a regular-sized arrow that Bard fires from his great bow. He doesn't climb onto the bell tower and craft a makeshift wind lance from his leftover bowstring and his son. First of all, that's impossible if you know anything about how bows are made. But second, in the book, we read that after Bard fires the arrow, it completely disappears into Smaug's chest, which makes way more sense than it only piercing about 1 or 2 feet deep into the beast. In the movie, I always watched it and thought, how in the world did that kill Smaug? That was like a pinprick to a beast of his size. But in the book, if the arrow went straight through him and pierced his vital organs, it would make sense that he would be killed by it. Anyway, what do you think of that moment? Am I crazy or am I onto something there? Now moving on, we have only a couple of changes left. First, the Master does not die in the book, but rather he runs to the shoreline like a coward, and then when Bard survives, he plays politician. Not wanting to lose his rank to Bard's new popularity, as all of the people of the town are saying down with Moneybags and up with the archer, the Master says that Bard can be king of Dale, but the men of Laketown have always elected a master from the old and wise. Bard agrees with this and says that he will only stay with the people of Laketown for now while they rebuild, but eventually he might go to Dale with those who are willing. By the way, this isn't from a completely selfless heart on Bard's part. We read that the Master tries to stir up the people against the dwarves to divert their attention away from him, and Bard says that they're being fools as the dwarves are most likely dead. But after he says this, Bard realizes that if the dwarves are dead, then the mountain must be empty with all of that gold, and that Dale would be a fine location to rebuild and gain wealth. So that is why he promises to help the Master rebuild, and then he will eventually go to Dale. In his mind, he'd be getting the better deal, as Dale is way larger and wealthier than the town on the lake. Oh, and I guess I'll throw a small change in here, which is that all these parts with Alfred don't exist because Alfred doesn't exist. But anyway, our final change is that after this conversation with the Master, Bard takes charge and sends messengers to the Elven King, asking for aid. Of course, the Elven King had already heard of the dragon's death, as he had sent his own agents among the people of the lake. But when he received word from Bard, he pitied the men of the town and decided to march to them with aid. And of course, it would serve his own purposes, as he believed Thorin to be dead and there to be a mountain full of gold waiting for them. But on that note, that wraps up all of our changes for this first part of the Battle of the Five Armies. So what do you think? Do you prefer the movie version of Bard, or do you think that Tolkien did it best by not investing too much character development in this random man? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.